The hook. "Come with me," the stranger had said, and Clara's rational mind, the part that had survived 42 winters and countless disappointments, should have screamed in protest. Instead, she found herself studying the sharp angles of his face in the storm's eerie luminescence, noting how snowflakes seemed to avoid his dark hair entirely. "Put me down." Her voice emerged as barely a whisper, throat raw from breathing the mountain's merciless air. "I can walk." A sound escaped him that might have been laughter if it hadn't felt so ancient. "Mrs. Whitmore, you were dying when I found you. Your lips had turned blue as mountain forget-me-nots, and your pulse—" He paused, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps it's best you conserve your strength." The use of her married name sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the blizzard. She'd never told him her name. In fact, she was certain she'd never seen this man before in Silverfall, and she knew every face in their small mining community. His features would have been impossible to forget. Aristocratic cheekbones that belonged in oil paintings, skin pale as fresh snow, and those unsettling eyes that seemed to hold starlight. "How do you know who I am?" Silverfall is not so large a town that a schoolteacher's reputation doesn't precede her, especially one recently widowed. His accent carried hints of old European wealth, each syllable precisely formed, despite the wind that howled around them with supernatural fury. "Your husband spoke of you often." Clara's heart stuttered. "You knew Thomas?" Something shifted in the stranger's expression, a shadow passing over features already obscured by the storm. "We had business together. Mining ventures are rarely as straightforward as they appear, Mrs. Whitmore." The way he said it made her stomach clench. Thomas had been keeping secrets in those final weeks before the collapse. Late nights, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, and an increasingly haunted look that had replaced his usual jovial demeanor. She'd attributed it to the pressures of the mine, the mounting debts, the reality that their modest dreams were crumbling like the mountain itself. But this man's tone suggested something far more complex. "What kind of business?" she pressed, though the effort of speaking was becoming monumental. Despite his warmth against her frozen skin, exhaustion pulled at her consciousness like a persistent tide, the kind best discussed when you're not on the verge of joining your husband in the grave. The bluntness of his words should have offended her, but Clara found herself oddly grateful for honesty, instead of the gentle platitudes that had suffocated her for months. Everyone in Silverfall treated her like fragile china now, as if grief might shatter her completely. This stranger spoke to her as if she were still capable of handling difficult truths. Through the swirling snow, impossible shapes began to emerge. Gas lamps flickered in the distance, their warm glow cutting through the storm with unnatural steadiness. Clara blinked hard, certain the cold was creating hallucinations, but the lights remained. As they drew closer, the outline of a structure materialized, not the rough-hewn cabins and practical buildings that dotted the mountain territory, but something that belonged to a different world entirely. A Victorian mansion rose from the wilderness like a fever dream, complete with ornate gables, wraparound porches, and windows that glowed with golden warmth. Impossible gardens, somehow still green despite the season, bordered a cobblestone path that should have been buried under 3 feet of snow. Instead, the stones gleamed as if recently swept, and the air around the property felt several degrees warmer. "This can't be real," Clara breathed, her scientific mind reeling. She'd lived in these mountains for 15 years, had explored every trail and ridge within a day's journey of town. This mansion simply didn't exist. Reality, I've found, is far more flexible than most people believe. The stranger's voice held a note of amusement as he carried her up the pristine front steps. "Welcome to Ravencroft Manor, Mrs. Whitmore. I do hope you'll find your stay illuminating." The massive front doors opened before they reached them, though Clara saw no servants or mechanism that might explain the phenomenon. Warmth rushed out to embrace them, carrying scents of cedar, aged leather, and something sweetly metallic that made her think of copper pennies and iron-rich soil. As they crossed the threshold, Clara caught sight of her reflection in an ornate hall mirror. Her face was deathly pale, Her dark hair escaped from its pins and wound around her shoulders, but her eyes held a spark she hadn't seen since before Thomas died. Fear, yes, but also something else entirely. For the first time in months, Clara Whitmore felt truly alive. The stranger noticed her expression and smiled, revealing teeth that seemed unusually white in the lamplight. "Rest now, my dear. Tomorrow we'll discuss why your husband's death was not the accident it appeared to be." The promise of revelations about Thomas's death hung in the air like incense, heavy and intoxicating, but exhaustion claimed Clara before she could respond. She had the vague impression of being carried up a sweeping staircase, of silk wallpaper and crystal sconces that cast dancing shadows, of being placed gently upon a bed, softer than anything she'd known in years. Then darkness embraced her completely. When consciousness returned, pale winter sunlight filtered through windows that shouldn't exist, illuminating a room that belonged in a European palace rather than the Colorado wilderness. Clara lay still for several heartbeats, cataloguing details with the methodical precision that had served her well in the classroom. Mahogany furniture polished to a mirror shine, burgundy velvet curtains heavy enough to block out the world, a fireplace where logs crackled merrily, filling the air with cedar warmth. Her own clothes had been replaced with a nightgown of white cotton so fine it felt like silk against her skin, modest yet luxurious, with pearl buttons and delicate embroidery at the throat. Someone had tended her frostbitten fingers, wrapping them in soft bandages that smelled of lavender and something medicinal she couldn't identify. The stranger, Lucian, he'd called himself, was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered in the room like an echo. Clara found herself thinking of his pale hands, how they'd felt warm even through her frozen despair, and the way his eyes had seemed to see straight through to her soul. Such thoughts were improper for a woman still wearing mourning clothes, yet she couldn't banish them entirely. A silver tray waited on the bedside table, bearing tea that still steamed, despite having no visible source of heat, along with delicate pastries that made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, before her journey to deliver medicine to young Timothy Morrison, whose fever had finally broken thanks to her efforts. The boy would recover, she was certain, though she wondered if anyone in Silverfall had noticed her absence yet. The thought brought a bitter laugh to her lips. Who would notice? Since Thomas's funeral 3 months ago, her world had contracted to the confines of the one-room schoolhouse and her empty cabin. The other wives in town meant well with their casseroles and concerned glances, but their pity felt suffocating. She was the tragic figure now, the widow who'd lost everything when the mine collapsed, and their kindness only emphasized how alone she'd become. Even before Thomas's death, her life had followed predictable rhythms: morning prayers and porridge, teaching reading and arithmetic to children whose futures would likely mirror their parents', hard work, modest hopes, early graves from mining accidents or winter's cruelty, evening meals eaten in companionable silence while Thomas read mining reports by lamplight, Sunday services where Reverend Patterson spoke of God's plan, while she wondered why that plan seemed so determined to crush the spirits of good people. It was a respectable life, even a comfortable one by Silverfall's standards. The school teacher's position provided steady income and social standing. Her marriage had been built on mutual affection if not grand passion. She had her books, her small garden, the satisfaction of watching young minds discover the world beyond their mountain valley. Yet lying in this impossible mansion, Clara acknowledged a truth she'd never dared voice. She had been slowly dying long before last night's blizzard. Not from grief alone, though Thomas's loss had carved a hollow space in her chest. No, the dying had begun years earlier, a gradual erosion of dreams she'd once harbored but never spoken aloud. She'd wanted to travel, to see the great cities Thomas described from his youth in Boston. She'd wanted children of her own, not just the borrowed affection of students who called her Miss Clara with careful respect. She'd wanted conversations that challenged her mind, not just discussions of weather and mining yields. She'd wanted to feel desired, truly desired, as a woman, rather than simply valued as a wife who kept house efficiently and asked few questions. The stranger's touch had awakened something she'd thought permanently buried beneath layers of propriety and resignation. When he'd smiled at her in the mirror, she'd felt beautiful for the first time in years. Dangerous, perhaps, but beautiful nonetheless. Clara rose from the bed, testing her strength. The frostbite pain had faded to manageable aches, and her breathing came easily in the warm air. Outside the windows, snow continued to fall, but here she felt protected from winter's cruelty. Protected and pampered in ways that should have made her suspicious, but instead filled her with guilty pleasure. Whatever Lucian Ashford was, and her rational mind insisted he was not entirely what he seemed, he had saved her from more than just the storm. He had reminded her that Clara Whitmore existed beneath the widow's weeds and teacher's duties, that she was still a woman capable of wanting things beyond mere survival. The question now was whether she possessed the courage to claim them, regardless of the cost. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but within these walls, Clara felt something stirring that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the intoxicating possibility of transformation. Clara moved to the window, drawn by an inexplicable need to verify that the world beyond these walls still existed. The storm had intensified, transforming the landscape into a white void where nothing familiar remained visible. Not the distant peaks she knew by heart, nor the winding trail that should lead back to Silverfall. It was as if Ravencroft Manor existed in its own pocket of reality, untethered from the geography she'd called home for 15 years. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. "Mrs. Whitmore." Lucian's voice carried through the heavy door with that same cultured precision. "Might I come in? There are matters we should discuss." Clara glanced down at her borrowed nightgown, acutely aware of her disheveled state. In Silverfall, such informality would scandalize the church ladies for months. Here, propriety felt like a costume she could choose to wear or discard. "Please, enter." Lucian stepped into the room carrying a burgundy dress draped over his arm, and Clara's breath caught. The gown was exquisite, silk the color of dark wine with jet buttons and intricate beadwork that caught the firelight. It was also unmistakably from another era, styled in the fashion she'd seen in daguerreotypes from her grandmother's youth. "I thought you might prefer to dress before we speak," he said, his pale eyes unreadable. "This belonged to a previous guest. I believe it will suit you perfectly." Clara accepted the garment, noting how the fabric seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The weight of it was substantial, luxurious in a way that made her cotton teaching dresses feel like burlap. "A previous guest?" "Ravencroft has hosted many visitors over the years. Some stayed longer than others." Something in his tone made her shiver, though the room remained perfectly warm. "I'll wait for you in the library. Take the main staircase down, then follow the hall to your left. You'll know the room by its scent, old leather and secrets." He moved toward the door with fluid grace, pausing at the threshold. "Clara, may I call you Clara? What I'm about to show you will change everything you believe about your husband's death and your own destiny. Once you descend those stairs, there will be no returning to the woman you were yesterday. The choice is entirely yours." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Clara alone with the dress and a decision that felt far heavier than silk and beadwork. She held the gown against herself, studying her reflection in the ornate mirror. The deep burgundy transformed her pale complexion, making her dark eyes appear luminous and mysterious. She looked like someone else entirely, not the practical schoolteacher or grieving widow, but a woman capable of dangerous choices. Her fingers traced the intricate beadwork as fragments of memory surfaced unbidden. Thomas's increasingly secretive behavior in those final weeks. His nervous glances whenever she asked about his meetings with out-of-town investors. The way he'd started checking the locks twice each night and insisted she carry his old pistol when walking alone. He'd claimed it was simple caution, that mining towns attracted unsavory characters, but his haunted expression had suggested deeper fears. Most disturbing of all were his final words, spoken as the mine's timber supports groaned ominously around them during her last visit. "Clara, if anything happens to me, don't trust anyone who comes asking questions about our partnership agreements. Promise me." She'd laughed off his morbid concerns, teasing him about reading too many penny dreadfuls. 3 days later, the main shaft had collapsed, burying Thomas and 4 other men beneath tons of rock and broken dreams. The official investigation had blamed structural failure, age, and the mountain's unforgiving nature. But now Lucian's words echoed with sinister implications. "Your husband's death was not the accident it appeared to be." Clara's hands trembled as she unlaced the nightgown. If Thomas had been murdered, and the very thought seemed melodramatic, yet somehow fitting for this impossible place, then someone in Silverfall had secrets worth killing for. Someone she might have shared Sunday dinners with, someone whose children she taught daily multiplication tables and moral lessons. The burgundy dress slipped over her skin like liquid shadow, fitting as though tailored specifically for her body. Clara fastened the jet buttons with growing determination. Whatever truths awaited in Lucian's library, she would face them. The alternative, returning to her half-life of teaching and mourning while Thomas's murderer walked free, had become unbearable. She paused at the bedroom door, hand on the crystal knob, fully aware that Lucian had spoken truly. Descending those stairs would irrevocably alter the trajectory of her existence. The Clara who climbed back up them would be forever changed, possibly damned, certainly no longer the respectable widow who'd nearly died in last night's storm. Yet as she turned the handle and stepped into the hallway where shadows danced like living things, Clara felt her pulse quicken with something that had nothing to do with fear. For the first time since Thomas's funeral, she was moving toward something rather than merely surviving. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, she would finally know the truth. The choice, as Lucian had said, was entirely hers, and Clara Whitmore chose knowledge over safety, mystery over mourning, and transformation over the slow death of respectability. The hallway stretched before Clara like a cathedral corridor, its length seeming to expand and contract with each step she took. Gas lamps flickered in crystal sconces, casting shadows that moved independent of any earthly flame, and she found herself pausing repeatedly, her earlier determination wavering like candlelight in an unfelt wind. What was she doing? The question hammered against her temples with increasing urgency. She was a schoolteacher from a small mountain town, not some gothic heroine from the novels she secretively devoured by lamplight. Real women didn't walk through impossible mansions wearing dead women's dresses to meet mysterious strangers who spoke of murder and destiny. Real women remained in their proper places, accepted their losses, and found quiet contentment in duty and respectability. Clara's fingers brushed the burgundy silk of her borrowed gown, and she wondered about its previous owner. How long ago had another woman worn this dress through these same halls? What choice had she faced? More importantly, what had become of her? The fabric held no trace of perfume or body oils, as if it had been preserved in some timeless state, waiting for the next woman foolish enough to don it. Her steps slowed as she passed doorways that gaped like dark mouths. Through one, she glimpsed a music room where a piano sat with its lid raised, sheet music scattered across its bench as if someone had just stepped away mid-performance. Through another, she saw what appeared to be a conservatory, filled with flowering plants that should have been dead in winter's grip, their blooms unnaturally vibrant in the perpetual twilight. Nothing in this place followed natural law, and that truth settled in her stomach like cold lead. If the mansion defied reality, what did that make Lucian? Her rational mind catalogued the impossibilities, his unnatural warmth in sub-zero temperatures, the way the front doors had opened without visible cause, how he'd carried her through the storm as if she weighed nothing at all. Thomas would have told her to turn around immediately. A practical, sensible husband had believed in hard work, honest dealings, and the comforting predictability of cause and effect. He would have found a dozen logical explanations for what she'd experienced. Hypothermia-induced hallucinations, perhaps, or some elaborate confidence scheme designed to separate a vulnerable widow from her modest savings. But Thomas was dead, possibly murdered, and his practical wisdom had not protected him from whatever forces had claimed his life. The thought brought Clara to a complete stop before an enormous painting that dominated the hallway's central alcove. The portrait depicted a woman in the exact dress Clara now wore, standing beside a tall, pale man whose features were hauntingly familiar. the woman's face was her own. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at her own likeness, painted in oils that appeared centuries old despite the impossibility of such a thing. The brushwork was masterful, capturing not just her physical features, but something deeper, a melancholy in the painted Clara's eyes that suggested knowledge of terrible truths, and beside her, the man she now recognized as Lucien gazed out with an expression of possessive adoration that made her skin burn. She reached toward the portrait with trembling fingers, then jerked her hand back as if the paint might still be wet. Whatever game Lucien was playing, whatever supernatural forces were at work in this place, she was not the first Clara to face these choices. The painted woman seemed to watch her with knowing sympathy, and Clara wondered if she was looking at a vision of her own future, or her doom. The weight of generations pressed down upon her shoulders. How many women had walked this hallway? How many had worn this dress, faced these same impossible decisions, gazed upon their own painted faces and wondered if they were seeing prophecy or memorial? Were they still here somewhere, trapped within these walls like butterflies in amber, or had they found something else entirely? Clara's pulse thundered so loudly, she was certain it could be heard throughout the mansion. Every instinct her mother had drilled into her screamed warnings. Respectable women did not consort with mysterious strangers, did not trust in supernatural promises, did not abandon the safety of known worlds for the seductive pull of the impossible. The life she'd built in Silverfall might be suffocating, but it was real, solid, comprehensible. Yet as she stood before her own painted image, Clara recognized that the woman in the portrait possessed something the mirror had never shown her, a fierce, almost feral vitality that made her seem more alive than Clara had ever felt. Whatever fate had befallen the previous Clara, she had not faded quietly into widowhood and social irrelevance. She had burned bright enough to be immortalized in oils, to be remembered. The library waited somewhere ahead, along with Lucien's promised revelations about Thomas's death, but the painted woman's gaze seemed to whisper a different question entirely. What did it matter how Thomas had died if Clara herself had never truly lived? The burgundy dress rustled like autumn leaves as she finally moved forward, each step a conscious choice between the safety of ignorance and the terrifying possibility that some transformations were worth any price. The painted woman's eyes seemed to follow Clara as she tore herself away from the portrait, her reflection in the oils both promise and warning. She pressed her palm against her corseted chest, feeling her heart race against the burgundy silk like a caged bird desperate for flight. There was no turning back now, not after seeing her own face immortalized in brushstrokes that predated her birth, not after recognizing the hunger for life that blazed in those painted eyes. Her footsteps echoed through the corridor with increasing purpose, each click of borrowed heels marking her departure from the Clara who had nearly died in the storm. That woman, the grieving schoolteacher who measured her days in lessons and loneliness, was already becoming a memory, shed like an old skin. Whatever waited in Lucien's library, whatever truths about Thomas's death or her own mysterious connection to this impossible place, she would face them with the fierce vitality she'd glimpsed in oil and varnish. The hallway curved gradually left, and Clara caught the scent Lucien had promised. Rich leather mingled with something else, something that spoke of secrets whispered in shadows and knowledge that came at a price. The library door stood ajar, revealing glimpses of towering bookshelves that seemed to stretch beyond the laws of architecture. Warm light spilled into the corridor like honey, beckoning her forward with the promise of illumination. Clara paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the ornate door handle. This was the moment Lucien had warned her about, the point of no return. Behind her lay the familiar world of Silverfall with its predictable sorrows and safe disappointments. Ahead lay mystery, danger, and the intoxicating possibility of becoming someone she'd never dared imagine. She thought of Timothy Morrison, the fever-stricken boy she'd risked her life to help. By now, his mother would have discovered Clara's absence, but would anyone organize a search party? The brutal truth settled in her stomach like winter wind. She could disappear from Silverfall without leaving more than a ripple. Her students would be assigned another teacher, her cabin would be sold to pay debts, and within a year, Clara Whitmore would be nothing more than a cautionary tale about widows who ventured too far from home. But here, in this place that existed outside time and reason, she had been expected. Her portrait hung in the hallway like a prophecy fulfilled. Lucien had known her name, her husband's secrets, the exact shape of her desperate hunger for something more than mere survival. For the first time in her 42 years, Clara felt truly seen. She pushed open the library doors. The room beyond defied every limitation she'd ever accepted. Books rose from floor to impossibly high ceiling, their leather spines gleaming in the light of a massive fireplace that crackled with flames that cast no smoke. Ladders on brass rails provided access to volumes that seemed to whisper their secrets even from a distance. The air thrummed with knowledge, not just the accumulated wisdom of centuries, but darker truths that respectable libraries would never house. Lucien stood before the fire, his pale profile sharp as carved marble against the dancing flames. He had changed from his storm-weathered clothes into formal evening wear that emphasized his ethereal beauty and otherworldly grace. When he turned to face her, his smile held both triumph and something that might have been regret. "You came," he said simply, and Clara heard in those two words the weight of inevitability, as if her choice had been written in the stars long before her birth. "Did you doubt I would?" She surprised herself with the steadiness of her voice, the way she moved into the room as if she belonged among its impossible wonders. "Never doubt. But hope and certainty are different creatures entirely." He gestured to a small table set with crystal glasses and a decanter filled with liquid that seemed to capture the firelight. "You've seen the portrait. It wasn't a question." Clara nodded, accepting the glass he offered, noting how their fingers brushed in the exchange and sent electricity racing up her arm. The wine, if it was wine, tasted of cherries and something darker, something that made her blood sing with unfamiliar warmth. "How many have there been?" she asked. "How many Claras have worn this dress, walked these halls, faced this choice?" Lucien's expression grew distant, as if he were seeing through centuries rather than across the room. "You are the first to ask that question." The others were so focused on what they were leaving behind that they never wondered about who had come before. And what became of them? They became what they chose to become. He moved closer, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. Some embraced transformation and found immortal purpose, others fought their nature until it consumed them. A few discovered that they were not meant for this existence at all. Clara set down her glass with deliberate care, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like the burgundy silk that rustled with her every breath. And Thomas? What did he choose? Lucien's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Thomas chose betrayal. "The question now, my dear Clara, is whether you will choose more wisely." The fire crackled, the books whispered their secrets, and Clara Whitmore stepped fully into the unknown. The word hung between them like a blade, betrayal, and Clara felt the wine turn to ash in her mouth. She set the glass down with hands that had begun to tremble, not from cold or fear, but from a rage so pure it surprised her with its intensity. "Explain," she said, and her voice carried a command that would have shocked her students. The grieving widow was dissolving entirely now, replaced by someone harder, someone who demanded truth regardless of its cost. Before Lucien could respond, a soft chime echoed through the library, followed by the measured tread of approaching footsteps. Clara spun toward the sound, her borrowed skirts whispering against the Persian carpet, and watched as the library doors opened to admit a figure that made her breath catch. The woman who entered moved with predatory grace, her silver hair swept into an elaborate coiffure that belonged to no earthly fashion. She wore midnight blue silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and her face. Clara's mind struggled to process what she saw there. Beautiful, certainly, but beautiful in the way winter storms were beautiful, with sharp cheekbones that could cut glass and eyes like polished obsidian. "Forgive the interruption," the woman said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent Clara couldn't place, something European ancient, refined. "But when the bells announced another awakening, I simply had to see for myself." "Clara," Lucien said with obvious reluctance, "may I present Madame Evangeline Ravencroft, the mistress of this house?" Clara's mind reeled. She had assumed Lucian owned the mansion, had thought herself his guest, but the way he deferred to this elegant predator, the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of acknowledgement rather than welcome, she had been wrong about fundamental truths yet again. Madame Ravencroft glided forward, and Clara noticed with growing unease that her footsteps made no sound despite the elaborate beadwork adorning her gown. "My dear child, you're even lovelier than the portrait suggested. Though I must say you wear that dress with considerably more spirit than your predecessor." "My predecessor?" Clara's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Oh, there have been several, haven't there, Lucian?" Madame Ravencroft's smile revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too white, though most never progressed beyond the initial interview. "You, however, have already shown remarkable promise by asking the right questions." Lucian moved protectively closer to Clara, and she caught the subtle tension between her mysterious savior and his apparent superior. Whatever forces governed this place, whatever rules constrained its inhabitants, she was witnessing a careful dance of power and protocol. "The rules, Clara," Madame Ravencroft continued, as if reading her thoughts, "are quite simple. This house exists between worlds, a sanctuary for those who have glimpsed the truth that lies beneath civilization's comfortable lies. We offer protection, knowledge, and certain enhancements to those worthy of our attention. At what cost?" Clara surprised herself by interrupting. The old Clara would have listened politely, absorbed information without challenging its source. But that woman had died in the blizzard. Madame Ravencroft's laugh was like silver bells wrapped in velvet. "Direct. I do appreciate directness. The cost, my dear, is everything you were, and the possibility of becoming everything you could be. Some find the exchange liberating, others—" she gestured dismissively. "Others cling to mortality like drowning sailors clutch driftwood." "And Thomas?" Clara stepped forward, matching the older woman's predatory energy with her own newfound steel. "What did my husband cling to?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lucian's hand found Clara's elbow, whether in support or warning she couldn't determine, while Madame Ravencroft's expression hardened into something beautiful and terrible. "Your husband, Mrs. Whitmore, was offered immortality and chose instead to expose our sanctuary to those who would destroy it. He photographed our records, copied our correspondence, and planned to deliver everything to federal investigators in Denver." The woman's voice carried centuries of disappointment. "Quite naturally, we could not permit such betrayal to succeed." Clara's world tilted on its axis. Thomas, practical, honest Thomas, had discovered this place, these people, and chosen duty over transformation. He had died not for mining rights or claim disputes, but for threatening something far older and more dangerous than Silverfall's petty human dramas. You killed him. It wasn't a question. We protected ourselves as any rational creatures would. The collapse was regrettable but necessary. Madame Ravencroft studied Clara's face with clinical interest. The question now is whether his widow possesses greater wisdom. Clara felt the weight of choice settling around her like chains made of possibility. Thomas had chosen humanity, mortality, the brief spark of mortal conscience over eternal existence. But Thomas had never walked through this impossible library, never felt the intoxicating pull of knowledge that stretched beyond human limitations. The fire crackled with supernatural warmth, the books whispered of secrets worth any sacrifice, and Clara Whitmore faced her first real test. Would she honor her husband's memory, or surpass his limitations? The silence stretched between them like a frozen lake, treacherous and ready to crack beneath the weight of Clara's next words. She felt Lucian's fingers tighten on her elbow, felt Madame Ravencroft's obsidian gaze dissecting her every expression, felt the ancient books pressing their whispered secrets against her consciousness until she thought her skull might split from the pressure. Thomas had died for his principles. Her practical, methodical husband had discovered this sanctuary of impossible beings and chosen exposure over acceptance, death over compromise. The man who had taught her to balance ledgers and mend fences had faced immortality and turned away, walking deliberately toward his own destruction. to protect a world that had never appreciated his quiet heroism. "You're waiting for me to denounce him," Clara said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. "To call him a fool for choosing mortality over your gifts." Madame Ravencroft's smile was razor-thin. "Aren't you?" "No." The word emerged with surprising force, surprising even Clara herself. "I'm wondering what you offered him that was so terrible he preferred death." The temperature plummeted further. Frost began forming on the wineglasses, and Clara watched her breath mist in the suddenly Arctic air. Lucien stepped partially in front of her, his movement protective and possessive in equal measure, while something dangerous flickered behind Madame Ravencroft's elegant composure. "Careful, child," the woman whispered, her voice carrying undertones that made Clara's bones ache. "You are a guest here, not yet family. That status can change with remarkable swiftness." But Clara felt something unfurling inside her chest, not fear, but a fierce exhilaration that made her blood sing. For the first time in her 42 years, she was having a conversation that mattered, facing stakes that transcended social propriety and domestic obligation. The woman in the portrait had worn this same expression, she realized. This was what vitality looked like. "Thomas was a good man," she continued, stepping out from behind Lucien's protective bulk. "Boring, perhaps. Predictable, certainly. But good. If he chose death over your offer, it wasn't from stupidity or cowardice. It was because he recognized something that should be refused. And you?" Madame Ravencroft glided closer, her movements liquid and predatory. "Do you share your husband's moral clarity?" The question hung in the air like incense, sweet and suffocating. Clara looked around the impossible library, at books that contained centuries of forbidden knowledge, at a fire that burned without smoke, at her mysterious savior whose pale beauty defied natural law. She thought of her empty cabin in Silverfall, of students who would forget her within a season, of the slow suffocation of respectability that had been strangling her since Thomas's funeral. "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty felt like stepping off a cliff. "But I want to understand what he refused before I decide whether his choice was wisdom or waste." Madame Ravencroft exchanged a look with Lucien that Clara couldn't decipher, surprise, perhaps, or approval. When the woman spoke again, her voice had lost some of its glacial edge. "Most who come here are driven by desperation or greed. They want eternal youth, unlimited power, freedom from mortality's constraints. Your husband wanted none of these things, and you—" She paused, studying Clara with renewed interest. "You want comprehension before commitment. How refreshingly unusual." "Knowledge has always been my weakness," Clara said, moving toward the towering bookshelves. She could feel power radiating from the ancient volumes, could sense secrets that would reshape everything she thought she knew about the world. "Thomas used to joke that I'd read myself into trouble someday." "Perhaps he was prophetic," Lucien murmured, his pale eyes reflecting something that might have been admiration or concern. Clara reached toward a leather-bound tome, whose spine bore symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly, then stopped herself. Once she opened that book, any of these books, there would be no unknowing what lay inside. Thomas had made his choice in ignorance of the full scope of what he refused. She would not make the same mistake. "Show me," she said, turning back to face her hosts. "Not your gifts or your promises or your threats. Show me what you truly are, what this place truly offers. Let me understand the choice Thomas made, and the choice you're asking me to make now." The silence that followed felt different, charged with possibility rather than tension. Madame Ravencroft smiled, and for the first time the expression seemed genuinely pleased rather than predatory. "Very well," she said, extending one pale hand toward Clara. "But understand, once you see the truth of us, you cannot unsee it. Knowledge, as you've noted, has its own dangers." Clara stared at the offered hand, recognizing the moment for what it was, the true threshold, the actual point of no return. Behind her lay Thomas's memory and the safe ignorance of human limitations. Ahead lay understanding that would forever change how she saw the world. She reached out and grasped Madame Ravencroft's fingers, feeling coldness that burned like fire race up her arm. The world exploded into sensation. Clara's vision fractured like a kaleidoscope, reality bleeding into impossible geometries as Madame Ravencroft's touch sent visions cascading through her mind. She saw the mansion as it truly was, not merely a dwelling but a nexus point where dimensions pressed against each other like lovers sharing breath. The walls breathed with accumulated centuries, and the very air thrummed with the weight of countless souls who had crossed its threshold seeking transformation. "See," whispered a voice that might have been Madame Ravencroft's, or might have been the house itself. "Understand." The library dissolved around her, replaced by flashing glimpses of truth that seared themselves into her consciousness. She saw Lucien as he had been centuries ago, not the elegant gentleman who had carried her through the storm, but something far older and more terrible. His pale beauty remained constant, but beneath it lurked predatory hunger that had sustained him through decades of darkness. She watched him moving through gaslit London streets, selecting victims with artistic precision, feeding on more than blood, on hope, on dreams, on the very essence that made mortals human. "This is what saved you," the voice murmured with dark amusement. "This is what desires you." The visions shifted, showing her Madame Ravencroft's true nature. The elegant woman was a collector, not of objects but of souls, each guest in her impossible mansion a carefully chosen addition to her eternal gallery. Clara saw dozens of portraits lining corridors that existed beyond normal space, faces frozen in expressions of rapture or terror as they discovered what their transformation truly entailed. "Some embrace their new nature," the voice explained as Clara watched a young man from decades past glory in his supernatural strength, using it to tear apart those who had once scorned him. "Others resist until resistance becomes madness." Another figure flashed before her eyes, a woman in Edwardian dress, clawing at walls that bled shadow, screaming for immortality she could never reclaim. But it was the final vision that stopped Clara's heart entirely. Thomas stood in this very library, younger than she remembered him, his honest face illuminated by the same supernatural firelight. But his expression held no wonder, only horror, as Madame Ravencroft revealed tome after tome documenting centuries of predation, lists of names, detailed records of transformations, careful notations tracking which subjects proved viable and which had to be disposed of. "You're building an army," Thomas said in the vision, his voice tight with revulsion. "These aren't guests or voluntary transformations. You're creating weapons." "We're creating evolution," Madame Ravencroft replied with the same cold elegance Clara recognized. "Humanity has proven itself unworthy of dominion over this world. We offer improvement to selected specimens while culling the unnecessary remainder." Clara watched her husband's face crumble as he understood the true scope of what he'd discovered. This wasn't simply a sanctuary for supernatural beings, it was a staging ground for something far more sinister. The careful selection of residents, the detailed records, the strategic placement of the mansion itself near isolated communities like Silverfall, everything pointed toward eventual conquest rather than coexistence. "The photographs you've seen," Madame Ravencroft continued in the memory, "document our successes across 3 states. Within a decade we'll have sufficient numbers to begin the larger work. Humanity's long sleep is nearly over." Thomas had stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in his haste to reach the door. But Lucien appeared behind him with supernatural speed, pale hands settling on Thomas's shoulders with deceptive gentleness. "The choice, as always, is yours," Lucien had said, and Clara heard genuine regret in his voice. "Join us willingly, and you'll live to see the new world we're building. Refuse?" "I refuse," Thomas had said immediately, his voice stronger than Clara had ever heard it. "Whatever you are, whatever you're planning, I refuse." The vision shattered as Clara jerked her hand away from Madame Ravencroft's grip, reality crashing back around her like broken glass. She found herself on her knees in the library, her borrowed gown pooling around her like spilled blood, her chest heaving as if she'd run for miles. "Now you understand," Madame Ravencroft said softly, smoothing her midnight silk skirts with elegant unconcern. "Your husband saw our true purpose and chose martyrdom over participation. A noble choice, if ultimately futile." Clara raised her head, meeting those obsidian eyes with her own gaze blazing. Every comfortable illusion had been stripped away. Lucien's romantic salvation, the mansion's gothic hospitality, her own importance as anything more than another potential weapon in an immortal war against humanity itself. "And you expect me to make a different choice?" she whispered, her voice raw from screaming she didn't remember. "Expect?" Madame Ravencroft smiled, revealing teeth sharp as crystal. "My dear Clara, we don't expect anything. But hope is eternal, isn't it, Lucien?" Clara turned toward her supposed savior, seeing him clearly for the first time, beautiful, damned, and utterly alien despite his human form. The choice Thomas had made now lay before her, and this time there would be no noble death to escape its consequences. The ordeal of truth had only just begun. Clara struggled to her feet, her borrowed gown torn from where she'd collapsed, the elegant silk now marking her as victim rather than guest. The taste of copper filled her mouth. She must have bitten her tongue during the visions, and every nerve in her body felt stripped, raw, exposed to currents of power that had never been meant for mortal flesh. "Thomas tried to warn them," she said, her voice emerging as little more than a croak. "The federal investigators. That's why you killed him." "We prevented a misunderstanding," Madame Ravencroft corrected with clinical precision. "Your husband possessed certain documentation that would have invited unwelcome attention. The mining accident was merely a convenient cover for necessary intervention." Clara's hands clenched into fists, her nails drawing blood from her palms. Everything she thought she knew about her husband's death had been another lie layered atop lies. Thomas hadn't died for mineral rights or claim disputes. He died trying to save a world that would never know his sacrifice. "The letters he was writing," she whispered, remembering the correspondence she'd found hidden in his desk after the funeral. Pages covered in his careful handwriting, documenting strange disappearances around Silverfall, noting patterns that had seemed like paranoid delusions to his grieving widow. He was building evidence. "Evidence that died with him," Lucien said quietly. Something in his tone made Clara turn toward him sharply, and she caught a flicker of what might have been regret crossing his pale features before he composed himself again. "You knew him," Clara realized with growing horror. "Before. You were there when he discovered this place." Lucien's silence was answer enough. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Her mysterious savior, the beautiful stranger who had carried her through the storm with such tender care. He had been present at her husband's murder. Perhaps he had even participated in the carefully orchestrated accident that had crushed Thomas beneath tons of rock and timber. "You saved me from the blizzard so you could finish what you started with him," she said, backing away from both of them. "This was never about rescue. You've been hunting me since the moment Thomas died." "We've been waiting," Madame Ravencroft corrected with infuriating calm. "Your husband's refusal created certain complications in our timeline. His widow, however, presents interesting opportunities for resolution." Clara's mind raced, connecting threads with the terrible clarity that comes after devastating revelation. The isolated cabin where Thomas had insisted they live, his increasing paranoia in the months before his death, the way he'd insisted she learn to shoot, to defend herself, as if he'd known something was coming for them. "He knew you'd come for me eventually," she breathed. "That's why he taught me to be independent. Why he made sure I could survive alone." "Your husband was remarkably prescient for a mortal," Madame Ravencroft agreed, though his preparations proved inadequate when faced with a blizzard of our design. The words hit Clara like ice water. Even her rescue had been orchestrated. The storm that had trapped her miles from home, the collapse that had left her helpless in the snow, even her miraculous salvation by Lucien's intervention. Every moment of the past few days had been carefully scripted theater, designed to bring her to this moment of choice. "The student," Clara said faintly, remembering little Mary Peterson, whose illness had sent her into the storm. Was she even sick? Madame Ravencroft's smile was answer enough. Clara sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the scope of manipulation that had shaped her life. Her marriage to Thomas, their move to Silverfall, perhaps even their initial meeting. How much had been natural and how much had been guided by immortal hands pursuing immortal goals. "Everything," she whispered. "Everything has been a lie." "Not everything," Lucian said, moving toward her with that fluid grace she now recognized as predatory rather than elegant. "Your strength is real. Your intelligence, your capacity for transformation, these are qualities we cannot manufacture, only recognize and cultivate." "Thomas had those same qualities," Clara snapped, finding anger beneath her despair. "And you killed him for refusing your cultivation." "Thomas lacked vision," Madame Ravencroft said dismissively. "He saw only what would be lost, never what could be gained. You, however, have already demonstrated superior adaptability." Clara looked around the impossible library, at books filled with centuries of accumulated horror, at the fire that burned without consuming, at her captors who wore human faces over monstrous appetites. The weight of choice pressed down on her like the mountain of stone that had crushed her husband's bones. But unlike Thomas, she had no evidence to preserve, no investigators to warn, no hope of exposing this sanctuary to outside intervention. Even if she somehow escaped the mansion, who would believe her testimony? A widow's claims about supernatural predators would be dismissed as grief-induced delusion. She was alone, powerless, and completely at their mercy. The realization settled over her like a burial shroud, suffocating in its finality. Thomas's sacrifice had bought the world nothing more than a brief delay, and now that respite was ending, all her husband's courage, all his principles, all his love, wasted